A great amount of time has passed since the last chapter of Remembering Borderlands, and in all honesty, I never really intended for it to return unless we came across something so extremely worth talking about. However, with that being said, I truly believe I have found just the subject. You see, as time ticks by, you'll often hear Borderlands players talk about the greats, such as the Snowman DLC, all the way up to the Revenge of the Cartels. But there is one piece of content that in particular stands out to me as the undeniable best of all time. So, in Chapter 5 of Remembering Borderlands, we're going to be discussing the greatest piece of endgame content to ever land inside of a Borderlands game. The Maliwan Takedown. So, launching on the 21st of November 2019, the Maliwan Takedown launched to a pretty positive reception from the Borderlands community, as the last time fans had ever seen a raid-style piece of content was Digistruct Peak. And I mean, we all know how that went. But I want to wind back the clock here for a second to talk about the pre-release of Maliwan Takedown, where expectations for the content was actually rather up in the air. As previously mentioned, Digistruct Peak from most people's perspective was a total fail, and as a result left fans worried for the launch of Maliwan Takedown. We were also aware that Maliwan would introduce Borderlands 3's first ever invincible enemy in the form of Wotan, who we'll touch more on later. But this left fans even more worried, and even a little angry, as at the time we still didn't know the purpose of the Ascension Bluff Door. So, with Maliwan rapidly approaching, only to possibly fall flat on its face, Borderlands fans were anxious to say the least. It's the day of release, and fans are pumped. To everyone's pleasure, Maliwan Takedown releases, and it is a hit with the community. The new items are fun and interesting, the bosses are unique and different, and the content is difficult. Everything that Maliwan Takedown was promising from Gearbox's teasers was seemingly true, as players endlessly consumed everything Maliwan Takedown had to offer. Build diversity skyrocketed as players found new ways to take down Wotan and his minions, and even skipping areas of the takedown. Maliwan was everything players had been asking for and more. Now, this is where you're probably expecting me to drop a huge however here. But that is just not the case. Maliwan really was everything it was supposed to be and never really fell off in the long run from my opinion. Players kept on running it over and over and over again as Maliwan continued to show why it was really the best content to date. So instead of me providing an unfortunate video downfall monologue, I instead want to take the opportunity in this video to take you on a tour of the takedown and present to you my case on why I believe Maliwan is just so perfect. And with this, the first pillar I want to discuss is the setting, because I solely believe that the setting of a piece of content plays a very large role in how it is received and attacked by the player. To better explain this point, picture yourself in a scenario where your job is to rob a bank, but you're never told that you're robbing a bank, and the place you're robbing does not look like a bank in the slightest. It fails to set the mood and ultimately leaves you feeling less immersed in the task at hand. However, in the case of Maliwan Takedown, from the very get-go we are reintroduced to Lorelei, a fairly established character who we know to be pretty badass. So when our first reintroduction to Lorelei post story is a proposition to form an attack on a Maliwan research facility after Lorelei learns that Maliwan is preparing a weapon to deploy onto Promethea, which would inevitably result in the death of many citizens, it maintains continuity whilst also making sure to sound badass at the same time. And then you land at the facility, where the setting of this location really starts to, no pun intended, set in. The exterior very clearly boasts a fortified trading base where all kinds of weapons could possibly be manufactured, and for this reason it keeps the player engaged with the idea of the content and also encourages them to delve deeper into it. So as we move on with the rest of this video, I want you to keep your eyes peeled for any hints as to where the feeling of immersion sinks in from the setting of the Maliwan Takedown. It's very subtle, but it is impactful to say the least. We're going to be treating the rest of this chapter almost as though we're running the takedown in real time so that we can properly digest it piece by piece. So, You know that you have to get into the facility, that's the mission given by, once again, Lorelei, and from the moment you flip the entrance switch, this is where I feel Maliwan Takedown really grabs the player by the hand on a level design aspect. And what do I mean by this? Well, the typical player, when entering an area, will naturally progress through it at their own pace depending on how they feel about the area at the time. Although I have a theory as to why it's so tempting to progress through the Maliwan Takedown in particular. And I'm going to give you a formal warning, it is going to get rather deep. Oftentimes, you may see companies such as McDonald's or Burger King using colors like orange and red in their logo. And because of the way the human body perceives those colors, for example, orange being a very warm color and blue being a cold color, they will often find comfort in making their way towards the establishment even if they're not going inside. And while it is slightly different in the case of the Maliwan Takedown as it mixes the two together, I do believe the same effect here is done via its level design. For instance, the moment the door opens to the Maliwan Takedown, the player is greeted by a downward slope just steep enough for our brain to recognize that this terrain isn't a threat to us, but is steep enough to make us want to travel down it. It shows that there isn't a case of no point of return here and that we can easily go back up into the start of the takedown shall we wish to do so. This is a very pivotal strategy done in a way comparable to teasing your fight or flight senses in your body, or as most would refer to it as, baiting. But yet it's done so subtle that you ultimately don't realize it's happening right in front of you until you reach the end of the slope where you're shown a distant image of the facility you are currently tasked with infiltrating. You as the player know that it will be a daunting task, but yet the scenery almost tricks your brain into thinking otherwise, and thus you press onwards. However, here comes the tricky part. Up until this very point, the player has been subliminally invited into a space not knowing play for play how it's going to go down. But this all comes to a screeching halt the moment they hit the outer walls of the takedown. Suddenly, you are no longer given the option between fight or flight because there are creatures behind you and troopers in front of you. You are instead hit with straight defense from the Maliwan troopers, subsequently being forced into a firefight with them. This all ends, however, once the walls open up and a path to the facility is carved for you to tackle, although this time the flames are turned up, once again subliminally forcing your decisions going forward. So all of a sudden, the calm downward slope from earlier is a roaring uphill into a facility where you know you'll be pushed to your limits. Now, let's take a break from this discussion for a second and focus more on the challenge itself ahead of the player. Let's assume you decide to continue your assault and successfully manage to take down the foes in your way, thus clearing the opening grounds of the research facility. Everything around you seems clear, until all of a sudden the door slowly comes open but very quickly reveals one hell of an offense as players are introduced to a new foe in the form of the Kraken. A four-legged war machine capable of ending your run in seconds shall you refuse to show it the respect it so requests. But the Kraken actually plays a pivotal role in the progression of the Maliwan Takedown, as this is the first major challenge the content throws at you, and while it may not seem that important, failure to reward players for its defeat would risk leaving a bitter taste in their mouths for the lack of reward. This is proven in cases such as the Guardian Takedown's challenging crystal encounters, where the player is ultimately rewarded with nothing for beating it, despite it being one of the most challenging tasks they've had ahead of them thus far. But luckily in the case of Maliwan, it does reward you right, offering you plenty of items for the Kraken's demise, even allowing you to break its legs for extra loot, whilst also helping you gear up for your first major boss fight of the takedown. The Valkyrie Squad. The Valkyrie Squad has to be easily one of the most unique boss fights we've seen to date in a Borderlands game, because unlike your typical bullet sponge boss who walks you down in what is usually a one-on-one, the Valkyries up the ante by turning the fight into a game of toughness and endurance by seeing whether or not you can weather the storm that they put up. After initially dropping the shield from one of the Valkyries, they retreat to their respective nests where you momentarily believe that you're already on track to stopping them. and then without notice, Maliwan troopers are airdropped in, forming an attack on you until the Valkyries are ready to plot their next move. From there, the Valkyries engage with the player in what is essentially a turn-based game of combat until eventually ganging up on the player one last time out of desperation. This fight plays a major part in the success of Maliwan Takedown, as it manages to keep the pace steady whilst also not letting you relax too much in the process. It's once again another element of this takedown which appeals to our mind's fight or flight senses. And one thing we may or may not have touched on so far is the pacing. The developers at this point know what the player needs to be moving through the content at a pace where they don't feel too overwhelmed. Otherwise, they could be tempted to simply just save and quit right then and there. For this reason, they present the Valkyries in a form which is easily digestible by the player and even rewards them with a checkpoint afterwards to reinforce that feeling of being in control, which encourages the player to move forward. This same feeling is touched on again the moment the player continues on after the Valkyrie Squad, where they're greeted by that same downward slope reminiscent of the beginning of the takedown, only this time it is a little steeper. So even though it once again plays on that warm, welcoming feeling via the level design, and even though the player knows that this time it won't be as welcoming, they push onwards anyway as they feel inclined to do so. These hints in the level, whether that be via pacing or via subliminally guiding players, I believe was done unintentionally by the developers, which is why it works so incredibly well. And continuing on from that feeling of knowing that the rest of the takedown won't be kind to the player, this is reinforced as you progress onwards, facing the most adversity you've had yet, with countless amounts of Maliwan forces trying to repel your attack. There are many theories as to why this is done, but I think the main reason just comes down to a very simple difficulty increase, as the moments following your initial checkpoint are essentially the road to Wotan the Invincible. This is why I feel the bridge is put in place. It symbolizes that final stretch before reaching the final big boss fight. Again, nothing too complicated, though interesting to say the least. So, you've taken the fight to Maliwan, destroyed the Kraken, vanquished the Valkyrie Squad, and pushed onwards to your final test. It is now time for you to face the final obstacle in your way. Wotan the Invincible. From the perspective of a Borderlands fan, to call the fight with Wotan anything less than history making feels almost disrespectful, as up until this point we hadn't really seen an Invincible fight take place as though it were a choreographed dance piece. I know that may sound bizarre to those of you who have never faced Wotan before, but for those of you who have, you should know exactly what I'm getting at with that notion. It feels like every part of the fight between the player and Wotan was handcrafted to flow together, almost effortlessly, ending up in an encounter which feels like a cutscene rather than an invincible fight. All of a sudden, that play on our instinct is thrown into a ferocious roar as we're forced to take down Wotan or succumb to his overwhelming power. However, luckily for the players, the fight, much like the Valkyries, is split up with a multitude of immunity phases which players would typically hate, but somehow the immunity phases in this fight manage to feel natural and not forced at all, which is a huge change of pace. The Wotan phases almost show the player that the immunity phases can be fun as the fight evolves, with Wotan either getting even more aggressive towards the player or splitting in two, subsequently changing the pace of the fight entirely, ensuring that the player always has to stay on their feet if they want to survive. It's a tremendous demonstration of boss design, which in my opinion culminated in Guardian Takedown being thrown to the wolves once players saw how the immunity phases in those fights never really seemed to change all too much in comparison, despite Gearbox's best efforts. But it doesn't just stop there. Pillars are being placed around the arena, and they allow players to take cover, but also get to high ground when they need to, should they want to gain an advantage over Wotan and his assailants. They even encourage this during the fight, with Wotan putting up a shield which almost directs the player to the pillar in order to get to that height advantage and take the shield down. It's an excellent strategy designed to make you think and reevaluate the way you tackle the fight. So with all of these tactics set in motion, the rest of the fight is completely up to the player. However, should they follow the subtle hints provided to them, Wotan will fall and the player will be rewarded with a handful of great loot to use in their following battles. And just like that, the Maliwan Takedown is concluded. Whenever I hop into this content and run through it, everything that I have mentioned thus far, from pacing to level design, just seems to be a minor detail in which I have to make a conscious effort in order to notice it, though it never fails to subliminally add to the overall feel of the experience. From the beginning of the takedown, players are taken on what is essentially a joyride through their mind as Maliwan tries to appeal to each sense of their brain during the gameplay. It's a strategy which may or may not be done intentionally, but somehow ends up working out for the better and resulting in an undeniably great challenge for the typical endgame player, and also a tall measuring stick for future content. And while future content would inevitably fail to live up to the hype of Maliwan Takedown in the case of Guardian Takedown, I don't think you can ever fill its place within the community, as even pieces like Revenge of the Cartels, while they do feel great, don't feel like they one-up Maliwan, but rather perform on their own level. That is why Maliwan Takedown, in my eyes, will go down in Borderlands history as one of, if not the best pieces of endgame content to ever release. But alas, with that being said, this is going to conclude Chapter 5 of Remembering Borderlands. This is a chapter I've wanted to talk about now for a long time, so I really hope you guys enjoyed it because I put a lot of work in putting this together. If you want to see more chapters, be sure to let me know what they might possibly be in the comment section down below. And with that being said, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.